It's Sunday, January 1, 2023. Happy New Year and welcome to the 45th episode of The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. I'm Anthony Davis. You can also subscribe to my 5-Minute News daily briefing podcast on iTunes or wherever you get yours. Joining us today is a man who worked as a speechwriter to George W. Bush, the author of 10 books, including Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy, and he's currently a staff writer at The Atlantic. Welcome, David Frum.
Thank you.
David, I read pretty much everything that you write, certainly in The Atlantic. You've written 10 books. I haven't read all of them, but I'm certainly au fait with them. And I'm always fascinated in people who have started out as traditional conservatives and Republicans who in recent years have had to kind of question their own allegiance. And obviously a lot of people like yourself have done that and written books about it. Just tell us very quickly a little bit about Trumpocalypse and or Trumpocalypse and how that came about.
I wrote 2 books about Donald Trump. The first was called Trumpocracy, and it was published in 2018. And it tried to set the stage for what I anticipated was to come. Trumpocalypse was written 2 years later, and it tried to take the measure of both the damage that had been done and also to offer some ideas as to how to put us on a better path. I did not anticipate quite the degree of chaos that there would be. I mean, the idea of a president actually plotting the violent overthrow of the election he just lost. I dreaded many things about Donald Trump, and I thought he was capable of just about anything. I did think he would try to hold on to office. I did not anticipate that he would try to do so by violence, but that's what we got.
There's a few big Donald Trump stories this week. 6 years of Trump's tax returns were made public by the Congressional Committee on Friday, which ends that kind of long-running effort to break precedent and keep them secret. We've also seen George Santos. He's a new congressman for the Republican Party. Many top Republicans are remaining silent over him fabricating large swathes of his biography. So we'll take a look at those stories in a moment. But first, I just want to ask you about something that you wrote, an article in The Atlantic in July 2021. And the headline was, "There's a word for what Trumpism is becoming." And then the graphic kind of wrote fascism, but dropped a couple of the letters.
Yeah.
I do think, I used to refer to it as the F word that nobody says. Why? How is it that, Americans especially are so inclined as to not want to go there and make those connections and those references to fascism as certainly as we know it in Europe?
Well, I think in Europe it's easier because in Europe you can see there have been many varieties of fascism. So to Americans, it means Hitler and the Nazis. And one of the things I kept saying through the early Trump years is there are many stops on the train line of bad before you get to Hitler Station. What Europeans understand is there are fascist movements in Romania, there are fascist movements in Bulgaria, there are fascist movements in France, there was a fascist movement in Great Britain, as a matter of fact. And some were politically very successful, some less successful, some more violent, some less violent, some more anti-Semitic, some less anti-Semitic. It wasn't exactly a coherent way of thinking about the world, but it was a coherent approach to politics. And especially since Donald Trump left office, the refusal to accept the legitimacy of constitutional processes, the cult of violence, the cult of the leader, the cult and the isolation of the leader from any kind of system or institution. I mean, at bottom, one of the things that drives fascism is the impatience with the idea that there should be rules and regulations and institutions, and they should bind everybody, even the charismatic leader. And Donald Trump became someone who became more and more impatient with that, but also taught big parts of his supporters to feel that same way. And so we have got a cult following him. Now, a lot of it is kind of farcical, like what happened in Arizona with this sad loser Governor Kerry Lake who won't accept the outcome. But you can see how if that election in Arizona had been somewhat closer, if her defeat had been less overwhelmingly apparent than it was, then someone who said, I refuse to accept it, I regard violence as a legitimate means or an acceptable means of settling disputes. This begins to begin to look like, not like National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s, but a lot like things that happened in Romania, in Bulgaria, in in France, in Britain, around that same time.
Fascism has actually been used by the right and is now being thrown at the left, isn't it? Referring to Joe Biden as a fascist. Yeah. Do you think that there's enough... I hate to kind of say there's not enough intellect in the debate that happens on the street, but, you know, in the same way that they refer to Bernie Sanders as a communist without really understanding communism or how it plays out in various countries. Well, is this a problem that these titles are actually so misunderstood that they have no value?
I think there's the problem, which is, mercifully, people live longer and longer than they used to do, which is a great thing. I say that as someone who's passed his 60th birthday. But it means that a lot of the people who are talking about politics are talking about a world that doesn't exist and are not keeping up with the world that does exist. And so when you talk to older people, people like myself, many of us are carrying a mental map of politics that is 30, 40, and 50 years out of date. And so a lot of these terms like right and left that were very understandable in the politics of the 1970s and 80s. What do they mean? So when you talk about people, I mean, fascism in the 1930s was a movement that attracted people, both from what had been the right and what had been the left. Mussolini started as a socialist and ended as a fascist. After the Soviets took over Germany, they found the best recruits to their new East German communist state were people who had been Nazis before. And anyone who takes part in online debates can see this, that many of Bernie Sanders himself, by the way, I do not include in this. He is I disagree with all of his policy choices, but he is an exemplary small d Democrat. He's a supporter of Ukraine. He is a socialist, but he is a truly democratic socialist.
But he's not an extremist, as he is painted. And isn't that when the word radical and extreme used to describe people who are liberal by any other definition is false? It's out of place. It's just used as drama.
Just to make this point, that the point is, are you someone who is committed to institutions and rules, or are you someone who wants to break them? What we've seen is many of the people around Bernie Sanders, not him, but many of his supporters in 2016, have ended up as Trumpists in all but name, especially the people on social media, because they were attracted to Bernie Sanders because this is a guy who's going to smash the Democratic Party. This is a guy who's going to smash Hillary Clinton. This is a guy, by the way, who's going to stand up for men against that castrating monster, Hillary Clinton. And so those emotions, a lot of people approach politics quite emotionally. Those emotions then put many of the people who are most passionate about Bernie Sanders in 2015, 2016, you can see them now as on what most people would call the far right. But have they really changed so much? Or is it that we're trying to plot a map that doesn't make sense? And I think a lot of us, I voted for Mitt Romney against Barack Obama in 2012. And I've been a Republican and a conservative all my political life. And if you were to give me a 100-question policy questionnaire, what should we do about, is rent control a good idea? How should we treat capital gains? Better to have freer trade or more. I'd probably get, a score in the 80s or 90s on the conservative answer. But I find that in today's crisis, with the questions that are most urgent now, I have a lot more in common with the people who disagree with me on those 80 to 90 questions, but who agree on how we are going to answer them. And who also agree, if you lose in court, that's it. It's over. The court, once the courts speak, you can't pick up a gun.
Isn't that the problem, though, that these definitions and the tribalism associated with them often don't match the actual kind of thinking of those people that join? I mean, the fascism argument is pretty simple as I see it, because there are people waving swastika flags who are doing their marches in the name of Donald Trump. So, I mean, it's not difficult to make that connection, but it's not happening on the other side. And yet Biden is being criticized for being corrupt and all of these things where there is not necessarily any evidence, but it just plays well. It's everyone's doing very well out of this whole toing and froing.
Look, we've been living, I think, probably as a result of the financial crisis of 2008-9, which was then followed in Europe immediately by the terrible Euro crisis of 2009 and 10. So two two of the worst economic events since the Great Depression, one on our side of the Atlantic, one on the other, happening in close succession, and that hit a generation of young people very hard. It displaced a generation of young men, made it hard for young families, for young men and women to find each other, to get married, to build homes, and disoriented a lot of people. So since those years, we have been living through a big crisis about whether democratic institutions, the kind that people on both sides of the Atlantic and in Japan and in Taiwan have built since World War II, whether those still meet the needs of the modern world. And that's the argument that has been going on. And so whatever you think about rent control and capital gains and free trade, free trade's part of this discussion a little bit more, but whatever you think about those things, the big issues in the 1970s and 1980s, we've been having this huge fundamental argument about how people should live together. And so it's not surprising that a Biden and a Romney find themselves with today's emergency more or less in the same place, and a Trump and a Corbyn find themselves in the same place. And it's not so surprising that a lot of people come from weird netherworlds that don't seem that political. I mean, you and I are talking on the weekend when Romanian authorities have just arrested an online influencer who made his living pimping videos of
a former kickboxer.
Allegedly. Yeah. So how does a person like that become a darling of what used to be the socially conservative right? And yet he has done.
But a reality TV show host became the president with no previous experience. Right. It's the same example.
So we're watching the categories get scrambled. Now here's the good news, which is, and I think as you and I speak at the end of 2022, democracy is getting the upper hand. I think I can feel the energy and the heroism on the battlefield in Ukraine is part of the story. Other things are part of the story too. But you can visibly feel that this anti-democratic movement of the extremes, of the far left, of the far right, this new thing that came into such prominence after 2010 is beginning to recede. That's the way it looks right now. If that is right, this is a very hopeful moment.
You talk about the economics of this. I blame everything on wages, and I have done for years. Looking at the economic graph and seeing how wages across the world, really, but if we certainly use Europe and the US as an example, around the kind of about 35 years ago, they stopped going up in line with inflation. So the cost of living got higher and greater, and wages didn't rise in accordance with that. And it has meant, it means that in the UK, certainly, people have been living under austerity now for over a decade with conservative governments and have got used to living with poverty wages. It's less pronounced in the US here, but I recognize that it is the reason that people butt heads all the time, because you have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make enough money to live, and no one can afford a house.
Well, economics is surely a big part of the story, and wages are an important part of economics. I think there's some other things that are going on, too. I think one of the things that has been very important has been the discrepancy between women's educational attainment and men's. Younger women are getting better and better educated. Young men are stalling out. Their educational growth is actually going into reverse. And so there is this educational gap between men and women, which leads to an income gap, which leads to marriages not being formed. And so I think sexual mistrust, the division of these two groups that obviously need to find each other, that's a big part of the story. I think global migration is an important part of the story. Global migration is both a tremendous resource for the societies that use it well, but it can also be a source of tremendous stress on societies.
And a stress on politics in the US, because, of course, migration is used as a weapon, and it's only going to get worse with climate change and everything else. People are going to have to get used to welcoming new groups into their countries, right?
Maybe there will be more migration. Maybe there will be less. It's very hard for me to predict. There are also factors that are going to reduce immigration, like the aging of the population all over the world. That's happening in Central America as much as it's happening in North America, and people who are 40 are less likely to move than people who are 20. And there are a lot more 40-year-olds everywhere than there used to be. But migration is always a source of strain on societies. And we saw this, we had some very dramatic examples of this in 2015, 2016, where you had both this huge migration of Syrian refugees and refugees from elsewhere in the Middle East and West Asia into Europe. And we also had this huge surge of unaccompanied minors from Central America into the United States in 2014 and 2016. And I don't think, those were precipitating events for both the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum. So I think it's going to be necessary to find ways to manage it. I don't think you tell people in a democratic society, this is coming to you whether you like it or not, because they will then say, well, if I don't like it, I will vote for somebody who promises to fix it. So with migration, with all of these things, we have that the whole point to constitutional systems is to say, your government can actually be in control of this, and you can have more and you can have less. And if you make a democratic choice, you don't have to find some authoritarian wacko to implement the changes you want. You vote for it, you'll get it. And so one of the things I kept writing during the early phases of the migration debate is that if liberals won't control borders and insist that only fascists will control borders, then voters will say, okay, then get us some of these fascists because the borders have to be controlled. It's a little bit like what happened on the crime issue in the 1960s and 70s when liberal politicians said there was nothing that can be done about crime. And so voters turned, that's the beginning of the great conservative surge. Voters said, let's find somebody who will do something about crime.
And crime is very much a flashpoint, isn't it? Because conservatives, I hate to use the phrase conservatives because I think, and I want to talk to you because you've written about this, about how conservatism has changed so drastically. But crime is, crime exists in every metropolis. It exists in every city around the world. But here in the US, it is very much used as collateral when it comes to electioneering. But no one seems to really offer any kind of direct policy on how they're going to deal with it. And we've certainly heard that from Republicans. And in fact, they maybe made a mistake in the midterms in using crime as that flashpoint because it didn't work out for them.
Well, look, crime is a tremendously important issue. America is a violent country, and there is a lot of violence here, and people are frightened by it very reasonably. People also use the phrase crime to mean the kind of urban disorder. You live in Los Angeles, you see it. It is not normal to have hundreds and thousands of people sleeping on tents in the streets. It's not normal to have defecation in the streets. And by the way,
why is it not normal though? Because it's happening in every city.
It didn't used to happen. This is a very new thing.
But that goes back to the economics and the graph and people not being able to afford a house. So I would argue it is normal.
No, it really doesn't seem to be economically. We've lived through this before. Between about 1992 and about 2012, we saw the steepest reduction of crime in American history. In fact, by the early 2010s, probably there was less crime in the United States than at any time since it was an organized society. And so one of the things that makes it hard when politicians poo-poo the crime issue, people can, within memory, say, it used to be better. It used to be better in New York. It used to be better in Los Angeles. And when I say used to, I mean like half a dozen years ago. We're not talking about, when I was a child.
Yeah, because the 1970s and 80s in New York was not a place where you wanted to walk at night.
So, I remember my wife and I had lived in New York in the early 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, at the worst days of the crack epidemic, and it was really it was pretty tough. And then we moved to Washington, and remember we came back to New York. We often came back to New York, but on this particular story, we were staying in New York for the 2004 Republican convention, and we're staying at a hotel right opposite the Port Authority bus terminal, which was in the 80s, the ground zero for the heroin trade. Yeah. And our two little kids, we had three children, our two older children who were at that point, both under 10 years old, asked at 11 o'clock at night if they could walk across the street to the ice cream store on the other side of 31st Street and get an ice cream by themselves. And you looked out the window and said, the biggest danger to you here is being trampled by all the hordes of happy tourists. I mean, it is, you could do that. You would not have allowed your children to do that in 1991, and you would not allow your children to do it today, but you would have in 2004. You would have in 2012. You would have in 2014. So this is a real challenge. It didn't work for the Republicans because, as you say, as an issue in 22 because it was so obviously cynical and not driven by anything.
Yeah.
And they also didn't have, what do you do? What are you going to do to get the tent cities off the streets? We have to get the tent cities off the streets.
Why has homelessness and crime been connected? Because, yes, of course, there is a knock-on effect, but homelessness is more of an economic issue and an addiction issue. It's more connected to the drug crisis.
People want to feel safe in their streets, and they want to feel that and they want to, and when they don't want you to tell them what. When you say, look, that homeless person, I don't think he's probably going to murder you. The mother pushing the stroller says, I care if he spits on me. When that happens, I was just talking. One of my children was just this very day on the subway in New York, and there was a man walked through the car ranting and raving, and when she stepped away from him, he spat at the back of her head. Now, is her life in danger? No. Should she have to live that way? No. And if a politician says, well, you need to live that way, or that's the punishment because the economy did, that politician isn't going to keep his job or her job. So
it's not a crime issue. It's that incident is a mental health issue, which no one seems to be making an offering to solve either.
Well, it's a public. You start with the question is when you solve it. What is the goal to which you are working? And this is. By the way, this is normal politics that we're talking about. But if normal politics doesn't get hold of this, abnormal politics will. Is your goal that, we have to solve mental health, which is a huge problem? And you say, you know what, we're going to start. There's no spitting on the subway. Yeah. And we don't know how we're going to get there. That's the end state. There are going to be no tents parked in public parks. That's the end state. And then it's going to be hard, and we're going to have to do some experimenting. We're going to try different things, but we are not going to live with this anymore. And that's something that Democratic politicians, small d, really need to commit themselves to, because it's not going to continue. It's not going to be acceptable. One of the little blips in the 22 election was, while there was no red wave nationwide, there was a red wave in the state of New York. And I think a lot of it had to do with this feeling of the politicians not being in control. So they need to be in control.
How did it get to the point where Donald Trump was able to kind of weaponize politicians as baddies? It wasn't just Donald Trump. It's been going on for years. But for the government to be evil and, here am I, a non-political person, and so I'm the one to be your savior. I mean, other politicians have done that over the years before. But Donald Trump really kind of galvanized that kind of anti-government sentiment. Yeah. And he did very well with that.
Well, I've spent a lot of my life in the company of politicians, and I think we all need to learn a little more respect for the very difficult job that they have to do. Politicians, what do they do for a living? Politicians are...
It's a rhetorical question, because I can't help it. It's rhetorical
because people think they do not, and people all think... You'll get somebody who's built a successful coffee company, and he'll say, "I can do it. Doesn't look that hard." And then he walks and he breaks his nose on the glass door instantly because he has no idea of how hard it is. Politicians are specialists in the mobilization of consent. That you have millions, tens of millions in the United States, hundreds of millions of people, and you have to get a plurality of them or a majority of the voters. To agree that take things in a certain way. And how do you persuade them to do that? There are all kinds of arts of persuasion and mobilization and identification, and it's really difficult work. And when it's not done, the results are pretty bad. I think one of the surprises for a lot of people was how effective Joe Biden has been at the job of president. And with one of the articles you were kind enough to reference, I wrote an article at the end of 2021 saying, when you look at how weak his hand was, 50 senators, not 51, 50 out of 100. So Kamala Harris there to cast the tie-breaking vote. A very scanty margin in the House of Representatives. Weak presence in the states in 21 and 22. And yet he got an extraordinary amount of things passed. And then he went on to an even better year in 2022 with one of the most remarkable midterm elections for the party of the president ever, and even more remarkable at the state level. Biden lost, I think the Democrats lost 9 seats in the House. They gained a net seat in the Senate. They picked up 2 governorships. All that is amazing enough.
Yeah, it's unprecedented.
Well, but what I'm about to tell you is unprecedented, or not since Franklin Roosevelt's time, which is, well, there are 99 state legislatures, and most of them are up for re-election in one way or another in this midterm. And normally the party of the president loses a lot of state legislatures. Biden did not lose a one. The first time that's happened since 1934. In fact, not only that, he gained 4 chambers. He gained a chamber in Minnesota, I think one in Pennsylvania, and I think 2 in Michigan, if I remember right. So that's and he's changed the state map, and and they defeated all of these Trumpy election deniers. I think some got reelected in the Dakotas and in Wyoming, which are not close states. But in the close states, the election deniers were all defeated, especially in crucial states like Wisconsin and Arizona. So it was a remarkable achievement, and a lot of
Republicans must have voted for Democrat. I mean, that is what must have happened. So I'm very interested to ask you, ignoring the MAGA Republicans and all the kind of fascist arguments and the screaming and shouting, there must be an increasing number of Republicans who look at the things that Biden has passed, because a lot of the infrastructure stuff, I mean, people like Ron DeSantis in Florida are taking credit for it, and talking about, oh, well, I'm doing this and I'm doing that. Well, yeah, hang on, that all came from federal money. So there must be Republicans who recognize that Biden, even though he's not the guy they would like to vote for, is actually delivering results for them at home on the ground.
I think he's done something even more remarkable. There are a lot of people who don't like what he's doing, who are voting for him anyway. And a real test case of this is what happened in the state of Arizona. So Arizona, the Republicans picked this Trumpy election denialist governor. And they picked a Trumpy election denialist attorney general, and they picked a Trumpy election denialist secretary of state. And all of
it was quite the lineup in Arizona, wasn't it? Yeah, I mean, it really was
They nominated a normal Republican for state treasurer. Money doesn't grow on trees, How is this going to be paid for is what I'd like to be asked. That kind of green eye shade, fiscally responsible, none. He won. He won. All the other Republicans lost. And so what I take away from that is there are a lot of people in Arizona who said, money doesn't grow on trees, and I don't know how all this spending is going to be paid for. But if the choice is spending more than I think is prudent or overturning our constitutional system, I'm going to go with the people who respect our constitutional system and spend more than I think is prudent. Not because I'm won over to their arguments about how much to spend, but because there are things that are more important. We can always fix the spending later.
There's this kind of overhang in the US, which is the fact that most of the money seems to go to the military. There's a kind of socialist system, where you employ people and you put them to work and you give them somewhere to live. And, $700 billion is being spent on the military, and it's signed off in both houses, and people seem to be quite comfortable with that. So there is this kind of, we don't really have this in the UK, putting the military on a pedestal in this way, whereas in the US it's very powerful, despite the fact that successive presidents now have removed these military people from theatres of war, bringing people back home. So to boast about having the biggest military but actually not be at war or even in a peacekeeping way is a bit of a contradiction in itself. How do you qualify as I presume you're like a fiscal conservative, right? Is that how you would describe yourself?
Let me just say something about how because there's a bit of an illusion in the military budget. Because Congress, we have the way we spend money is we have appropriations. That is, this is money where Congress actually says the amount we are going to spend on Project X is going to be Y amount. And then we have what are called entitlements. And entitlements are so called because Congress does not decide how much will be spent. Congress says everyone who is over age 65 or now over age 67 gets this much a month. However many, and we don't know what that number is going to be. It depends on how many people are alive who are over age 65 or age 67. And so we set a set of qualifications that entitle you to the money. Now those entitlements, that's 2/3 of federal spending. Now there's no vote on those because they just trundle along. So when you see that the military is the largest thing that Congress votes to spend money on, remember Congress does not vote every year on Social Security. It doesn't vote on Medicare. It doesn't vote on Medicaid. It votes every 5 years on farms. It votes every 4 years, I think, on the highways. So the military is a very spectacular, eye-catching budget item because Congress votes on it every year, and also because we tuck a lot of things into the military budget that aren't really military spending because the military has to be passed. But I think we are learning from this Ukraine war that is as expensive and often inefficient as the military is. The thing that is even more expensive is not having it when you need it. And we are going to be needing to spend, we are going to have to, I mean, my view is if there's anything in a Western arsenal that the Ukrainians could use and it's in a Western arsenal, somebody has blundered because it should already have been out of the arsenal on its way to Ukraine where they need it. But we're going to have to restock all of those things. And one of the things we're learning from the Ukraine war is that, we've been thinking since the end of the Cold War that what a war looks like is, low-intensity operations of a kind that even Iraq was compared to Ukraine as it was a low intensity. You spend only a certain amount of ammunition, you need only a certain amount of rockets, you only need a certain number of personnel. The idea that you could be in a life or death struggle that goes on for a long time in which you're blowing up thousands of rockets and tens of thousands of artillery shells every day, that's something we have not seen in a long time. And we're going to have to re-engineer a lot of our military thinking to imagine that, because a crisis in Korea, a crisis in East Asia, a crisis between China and Taiwan, it could look more like Ukraine than it looks like what we have seen from the end of the Cold War until Ukraine.
But it's going to change now that there's a Republican Congress, because there are many Republicans, especially quite prominent Republicans, who are on the wrong team. I mean, they are actually, they're on Putin's side. They don't want to spend money on Ukraine. And so this has been muddied, hasn't it? This kind of argument as to where Ukraine should sit in terms of being an ally. Yeah. It's been muddied by Republicans. And then, of course, there's the more extreme arm that are outright shouting that Putin is not the enemy.
Right. Well, Ukraine is not an ally because if you're an ally, I mean, that's like the platinum card of security. If you're an ally, you have American soldiers there, and so they're a partner. But they're a country that the United States supports, and Britain has supported, and the whole NATO alliance has supported. They're not quite a full ally. They're fighting their own war. It needs to be said, with a lot of help, but they're fighting their own war, and it has cut at very strange angles through a lot of the political system. And it's really split, as you say, it's split the Republican Party. I mean, Senator McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, has been rock solid on Ukraine, absolutely rock solid. Probably a majority of Republicans in the House are solid, but a significant minority is not. And because the leader of the Republicans in the House, Kevin McCarthy, both has a precarious personal position, and second, just isn't as strong-willed a figure as McConnell, the leader in the Senate, that there's more of a question mark. And so Kevin McCarthy will one day say, we can't issue Ukraine a blank check, and the next day he'll come out and he's wearing a yellow and blue Ukrainian flag, pocket square and necktie to show that his heart is with the Ukrainians.
Yeah. And it's these contradictions that fascinate me so much about American politics. It's how, politicians may have said one thing. I always think about Lindsey Graham, denouncing Donald Trump after January 6th, and then going and having a cup of tea with him, and then a week later being best friends and his greatest supporter. That even though it's on videotape, the proof that they've denounced or they've walked away or they've said, okay, I'm done, as he said, enough is enough, that they can turn on a dime.
Yeah.
Is that kind of exclusive to U.S. politics? Is the show business more important than the archive?
One of the President Biden said, somebody asked, I'm now going to forget the context where he said this, but I thought this was so right and true, and something a politician needs to keep ever uppermost in the brain. I know he was taking a question from school children, and what do I need to think about if I want to go into politics? And he had something B, and the third thing was you need to know what is the thing you will lose an election rather than do.
Right.
And that's one of the things that the great tragedy of the Republican Party in the Trump years was if a lot of Republicans had said back in 2016, you know what? I can't follow this guy. We're splitting the party. We're throwing away this election, and Hillary Clinton will win, and we don't like her, but it's not going to be the end of the world. And anyway, it'll be the third Obama term, and that means she's done for in 2020. We'll pick up Congress in 2018. We'll pick up the presidency in 2020. 4 years, it's a long history, and we'll send a lesson to the radicals in the party that they cannot take this party hostage like this. We will. The majority of us will stand down and let the election be lost. We would be on a very different place. Donald Trump's his power against the regular party was he always knew that he would blow up the party if unless he got his way, but they would not do the same. And so that's right now that the big donors, the elected officials, probably most people who are professional Republicans want to see Trump gone, but but he's declared for president in 2024, and they are frightened that unless he is mollified and managed, unless he wins maybe, that he will split the party. And they're not willing to do the same to him. If they had made it clear to him, we will split the party against you, we will accept the loss to keep you out of office, he would never have been president in the first place, and the whole world would look different.
Do you think the Republicans could have taken advantage of that first impeachment, and instead of setting him free in the Senate, if they'd have actually said, okay, you did try and extort Zelensky, and therefore, this is an impeachment, and therefore we did have to find a replacement. I mean, they could have saved the Republican Party then.
We could have saved a lot of trouble. I think something people don't quite reckon with enough is the two impeachments are the same story. Trump correctly read the 2018 result. When the Democrats had this wave election in the House of Representatives, he realized then that he was on his way to lose in 2020. People say things like, if it weren't for COVID, if it weren't for this, Trump knew he was on his way to defeat.
And it's the thing he hates the most is the prospect of losing. That is more palpable to him than anything else, right?
Because at some deep level, he knows he is indeed a loser. He knows his father was a better businson than he was, and he knows he's gone bankrupt all this time, and things just
it's the inner child.
Yeah, so he's got this inner lack. So he began working then on, I'm not going to win a fair and square election. So plan A, so he developed a series of crooked plans to win the election anyway. Plan A was to extort the Ukrainian state to fabricate a scandal against Joe Biden. Yeah,
digging up dirt on Biden and Hunter Biden.
Or inventing it.
Inventing it.
And Zelensky was the newly elected president. And the reason, and Trump targeted him because Zelensky, was also, he was another TV star.
The showman,
He was a comedian. He was regarded as generally, and he was a Russian speaker. He was not regarded as a Ukrainian super patriot. In fact, Putin thought that Zelensky might be sympathetic to him. Zelensky spoke Russian as a natural first language. He had to learn Ukrainian in adult life. He had shows successfully on Russian TV. He had kept company with some, rather scruffy Russian language oligarchs. So there was the Putinists had some hope in Zelensky. And Trump, and they somehow that was communicated to Trump, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to squeeze this guy, and I'm going to get out of him what I want." And that was our first indication of what Zelensky was really made of. And so,
he had a moral compass, which Trump didn't notice, and Putin wasn't expecting either.
And he was also quite wily because he didn't say no to Trump. He said, "I need more time. I need to do more work on this. I've got a process of my." He just played for time, and eventually the story exploded, and Zelensky never had to do it. But having failed at Plan A, extort Zelensky, Trump then said, "Okay, now I need my Plan B." And Plan B was first to try to tamper with the election by making it difficult for people to vote by mail in the middle of a COVID epidemic, and then second, this crazy scheme to falsify or
fake elections.
Yeah. And that had a Plan B1 and Plan B2. The first plan is to do it by fraud, by pressing people like the Georgia Secretary of State to find him the votes he needed. And then when all else failed, he turned to an outright act of violence. But it's the same through line. And so when the Republicans, one of the things when they kick themselves at opportunities missed, that it wasn't that by letting him go with the first impeachment that you then said, okay, he's learned his lesson, as one of them unfortunately said. The lesson he learned is I need to keep going. And in fact, I can get away with it. No one will stop me. And I can't be stopped until we actually have the spectacle of a president raising a mob against the capital of the United States.
So with this, with the fact that it's so blatant that Trump is a lifelong criminal, fraud is in his DNA. We're starting to see it with the announcement of the tax returns and how obviously he doesn't have the wealth that he claimed to, and having a bank account in China and various things, right? But that aside, here is a guy who, if he denied anything or said it was a hoax or said it was a witch hunt, and I'm talking about the Mueller report, I'm talking about even the Steele dossier, which in most part was genuine. I mean, a lot of it was used by Robert Mueller in putting together this document. If Trump says it's bad, it probably means it's true. And so with all of this rhetoric, it must be obvious to Republicans, even MAGA Republicans, but certainly fiscal conservatives and traditional conservatives, that the entire Trump presidency was a grift and was a stain on conservative politics. And yet he still managed to find 70 million votes.
Yeah.
So how do you qualify this as somebody who has a Republican background and your support hasn't wavered? I mean, those 4, you could call it 6 years because he's still going. I mean, that is a very, historically, we will look back on this period as being one of the darkest periods in American history, surely.
Well, yes, but also, this is a story I tell a lot. Do you remember the movie?
I'm keen for the caveat here, David.
Remember the movie Apollo 13?
Sure.
And it's just, they've got the astronauts lost in space, and they have the scene where they bring all these gears and parts, everything that's on the ship. They dump into a conference room and say, this is what the astronauts have got. You've got to find a solution to get them home. And this is the greatest catastrophe in NASA's history, somebody says. And then another character in the script says, this is our finest hour.
Right.
And everything you say, I'm not going to deny any of it. But it's also true that 2014 was the lowest turnout in a midterm election since World War II. 2018 was the highest turnout since World War I. But
still only 67%, though. It's not enough, is it?
2018. The last time we had turnout in a non-presidential year, like 2018, was before the First World War. And then we had a higher turnout as a share of the electorate. But remember, women couldn't vote.
Yeah.
Across most of the South, blacks were disenfranchised. People 18 to 21, of course, couldn't vote. So what you had is, when you look at the percentage of people, it's men and women. It's people of all races. It's 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and 20-year-olds, as well as 21-year-olds. The share of the American population that turned out in 2018, that was the largest Democratic non-presidential event in U.S. history. They came out in unprecedented commitment, and they stood in queues. And then they came back in 2020, and then they came back again in 2021, and they came back to turn the Senate Democratic, and then they came back in 2022. And people have been involved and committed. And everyone, as you know from your experience, everyone who's involved in public affairs, there's a level of commitment and intensity in the audiences that you had never seen.
Yeah, it's the engagement now, whereas prior to Trump, it was apathy for politics.
And so I think there's something with it that it may be that we needed Trump to make us understand that something that we took for granted was in danger, was precious and in danger.
Who needed Trump? Was it Americans? Was it conservatives and Republicans? Because Democrats didn't need Trump, and Democrats, many of whom public outspoken ones, including yourself, I would say, predicted the danger of Trump. I mean, even Hillary Clinton predicted it practically word for word in her speech. She knew what was coming. But
I think the society as a whole did not mobilize. And you can point to lots of people who did, but the society as a whole did not. But the society as a whole has done since then. And so, and I think we've had, and this is not a uniquely American thing. We've seen this across the developed world. I mean, that's one of the things that's so important about, the Ukraine wars. It's made us realize again why all these institutions our grandparents built in the dozen years after World War II, NATO, the World Trade Organization, all of these things, all these habits, your ability to get on a plane and travel around the world and not have not need any kind of, and many countries exchange each other's visas and use a credit card, and if there's a dispute with the merchant, it's adjudicated. There's no gunboats that are needed to settle your hotel bill. All of that was all built, and we of a certain age inherited it and enjoyed it and maybe neglected it, and then it began to crumble, as things that are neglected do, and now we have to build it back. And maybe it would have been better to be aware, but maybe that's not human nature to appreciate things all the time. Maybe you need the crisis. It's like in any kind of relationship. Crises can be good. They can force us to understand what we have and why it's important and why we need to protect it and maintain it.
But it's not being built back by Republicans. And if I can quote you from January 2018, you said, "I've had enough conservatives tell me I'm not a conservative. I think conservatism, it's really obsolete. Conservatism stopped describing the world we live in. It stopped having answers to the problems of the world that we live in. It's devolved into anti-leftism, tribal antipathy."
Yeah, that's all.
Just explain that.
Well, I grew up in the conservative movement, which had been around for a long time, but it really coalesced in the 1970s into a big movement. It had always been a small, marginal force. But in the 1970s, I wrote a book about the 1970s for a lot of reasons that I described in that book. It coalesced into a really powerful and ultimately dominant force in American politics. And in 1978, in 1988, in 1998, even in 2008, if you said, "I'm a conservative," that really was an intelligible thing in American politics. People knew what that meant. And they knew what you wouldn't do. They knew what kind of person, not only what kind of person you were, but what kind of person you
And some of those people said, "But I'm socially liberal as well."
Yeah, they might, but a conservative, there was a broad, look, we're talking about a huge country. Not everyone is the same. There are differences of emphasis, but a conservative. In the age of Trump, it began to be meaningless to say, "I'm a conservative." And so that article, I really stopped saying that. I'm still conservative. I'm still, as we discovered in our discussion about what do we do about public order, but that idea of that there was a conservative movement that overlapped with the Republican Party that stood for more or less the same things over a long period of time. I think that's really done. And and after all, why shouldn't it be done? When you look back on history, see, the issues of the 1840s are not the issues of the 1880s, and so the political map changes. And the issues of the 1920s are not the issues of the 1960s, and so the political map changes. Why should we assume that the issues of the 2020s are going to be the same as the issues of the 1980s? Why should we have the same map? Maybe we have new problems. We need new answers. And as we develop new answers, we're going to have new coalitions around those answers.
Isn't there a fundamental miscommunication, though? It's almost like people want to be tribal. They want to say, "I'm a Republican," and others are proud Democrats, socialists, progressives, whatever you choose to call them. But fundamentally, people really want the same thing. And if we were to take the main issues, the border crisis and immigration, both parties want to deal with that. They don't want to see swathes of people, because it's a humanitarian crisis now, and nobody wants that on either side. And Biden has actually done a lot more at the southern border than Republicans would ever give him credit for, including have Mexico pay for the technology to deal with it. So, and then just to kind of run the list, education I've always thought is a huge one on both sides. And so I would suggest that both parties, apart from the CRT garbage, there's probably a lot of common ground when it comes to education. Why is it that there is this kind of innate tribalism and this mudslinging when actually the major issues that would make America better or even arguably great again are shared by both parties equally?
Well, I think you only get people to share when you're at a very high level of generality. Implicit in what you're saying here is a feeling that disagreement is something upsetting or unnatural. Disagreement is natural. Disagreement is natural. Is probably even good because not.
But even for the sake of disagreement, because that's what I'm seeing.
But what democracy is a way to manage the disagreements we have in society, and so you mentioned education. An issue that has erupted across your state, California, has been many cities and counties operate magnet programs for students who test very well for academic gifts on standardized tests. And they create special programs, or sometimes even, as in San Francisco, special high schools for such people. Should such schools exist? There are benefits, there are consequences. Should we have, which is more important, the benefits or the consequences? People are going to disagree. That's not bad. That's not bad. Then they argue. They try to convince each other. Maybe they succeed. Possibly they fail. And at the end of the failure, they say, okay, there's only one way to settle this. Let's raise hands and have a count. And if whoever has more hands, we do it their way. And then a lot of people raise hands because they are moved by some ad rather than because they have a deep view. And then to pay for the ad, you have to raise money. And then you get everything that makes politics a little more circus-like. But what it comes down to is that to say we are going to have disagreements and we're going to settle them by raising hands. That's civil.
But the point I want to get to is this idea of owning the libs at whatever cost, and that actually the details of the policy are irrelevant, even to the extent that people would vote for something that they don't really believe in, just because they want to win one over those damn liberals. Well, it's like liberalism is a dirty word in America, whereas where I'm from in Europe, it's just normal.
The owning the libs comes about when actually there isn't a thing. When you're arguing about whether or not we should have these magnet schools or not, with the good points and the bad points of a magnet school, you're actually trying to win. You care about having the magnet school, or you care about having one system for everybody. So you don't gain anything for yourself by humiliating somebody on the other side because because you've got a goal: preserve the school, abolish the school. It's when you don't have that goal, when the contest is an end in itself, and that is a special consequence of how politics works on social media. It's a special consequence of having someone who is as idea free as Donald Trump, who's about his own ego, who's about these ethnic and tribal and sexual vendettas. But I don't think we should be afraid. We should be afraid to acknowledge that they're meaningful, like on the border. There are meaningful differences millions of people are trying to enter the United States. What should we do about that? No one thinks everyone should be allowed in. Nobody thinks nobody should be allowed in. But there are big differences between people who think it should be 500,000 a year, $1 million a year, $2 million a year, or that the border should, or that any asylum seeker who shows up should be admitted. So they have to solve that problem. And that's what the political process is for.
But there are additional factors involved, and that is xenophobia and racism and these kind of cultural effects that have been whipped up by the likes of Donald Trump, referring to Mexicans as criminals and rapists. I mean, that does not help when any party is trying to deal with immigration.
But your question shows you have a strong point of view. It betrays, your question betrays your commitment, which is great.
Because I'm an immigrant,
yeah.
And I guess as an immigrant, I recognize the plight of. Because I really don't think Americans in the main understand asylum. That this concept of asylum seeking is not the same as illegal immigration. And yet, again, that's something that's been muddied, I think, purposely by Republicans.
I was born in Canada. I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen. And in fact, I come from my mother was an American who's a naturalized Canadian citizen. So I come from a family of sort of like double backflip immigrants. The question of how the asylum system should work, I won't take because we're nearing the end of our time. I mean, I would disagree with you in your interpretation of it. But the point is not that is something unnatural or deviant or scary or upsetting. It's the theme of all my work is we need to have ways to regulate and adjudicate and decide those disagreements that are productive. And allow people and above all avoid violence, and sometimes people can ignore each other. For hundreds of years there was this question: well, how are Protestants and Catholics possibly going to live together? We're all going to have to be one thing, or we're all going to have to be the other thing, and we're going to have to, and you'll have to use violence to settle it one way or the other. And then we decide, it turns out they could, and the idea that people would go to war over that seems seems absurd. But it doesn't seem so absurd that people would go to war over being Sunni or Shiite, because that still does happen. So there are that we need these systems to build the ways to peacefully settle important social disagreements, whatever the social disagreements have to be, and not to wish away the social disagreements.
But that does require a more intellectual level of debate and argument. And in the public domain, in the town square, it is not done with any depth. It is mudslinging, and it's done with language that is inappropriate when you're talking about human life. And again, maybe the Trump presidency devalued the United States' ability to have that conversation because, maybe we just need new leadership. I mean, maybe that's the thing on all sides. I mean, I think Hakeem Jeffries is a very good new addition to this because the conversation is changing, and Pelosi represented the past in many ways.
On the other hand, people may surprise you. And I have a deep faith that not everybody, but most people, most of the time, are more open to reason than you might think. And it's near the end. I'll tell you a personal story that sort of has always shaped my thinking on this. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I was a writer for President Bush, and I was a big supporter of the Iraq War. Very controversial thing, now quite unpopular. I was in London on the day that the British Parliament voted on what was in effect the war resolution. It was a giant demonstration.
I was in the demonstration. It just shows where we sat on that. Yeah.
So I'd been in the House of Commons watching the debate, and then I hastily changed. I wanted to see the demonstration too, so I hastily changed clothes to be something a little bit more inconspicuous. And I was in the Trafalgar Square watching the events and looking pretty anonymous. But somebody recognized me, and a crowd, and pointed me out to other people, and a crowd began to form. And there were some pretty hot-headed people in that crowd, and the mood got really intense. I was probably surrounded by maybe 40, 50, maybe even more people. I don't know. I mean, not a huge audience, but there was a lot of shouting, and it was a noisy day, and they were sort of surrounding me, and I was backed up against the fountain, and I had to think about what to do. And so what finally happened was I stood on the lip of the fountain, and I said to the people, I'll tell you what, yes, I'm Frum, and yes, I did work for President Bush, and yes, I do support the war. I'm going to stay here for exactly half an hour, and I will answer any question you want to ask me about President Bush, about Prime Minister Blair, about the war. To the best of my ability, you're not going to disagree, but I will give you the best answer I can. And the first question was like a bullet. It was so angry, and I dealt with it as best I could. And the second question was the same. Each question after that, I noticed the temperature began. I was giving them honest answers, or at least the most honest answer I could give. And the temperature gradually came down. And then at the end of the half hour, someone said, "Can you stay for 10 more minutes?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll stay for 10 more minutes." And then I timed the 10 more minutes. At the end of the 10 minutes, the group parted and let me go. And one man, the last man I passed, gave me his phone number and said, "If you're ever in Manchester, come have a beer." And in fact, I did. I didn't change any minds. But
there is room for that level of debate, and the town square in the US, especially with the change of ownership of Twitter, because Twitter was, of course, one of the great modern town squares in a way, has changed significantly. One thing, and just to finish, one thing we haven't mentioned, which really is a lens on this whole political conversation, is the media, and how American media has been able to miscommunicate a lot of these subjects to voters. And people are going to the ballot box with false information because the media is skewed politically. And again, this is the reason why I started 5 Minute News, because I moved to the US and I was like, well, who knows what to trust? How does America recover from this discourse with where there's no regulation of the media, and if anything, it's becoming more partisan and more divided?
Well, we're in a revolutionary time, excuse me, I've got a friend who wants to be part of this conversation. We're in a revolutionary time where we're all the media. I mean, if you have one of these, you have more real-time video communication power than Walter Cronkite or Eric Sevareid or any of those giants of the past ever had. You can talk instantly to planet with video, with audio. So we're all the media, and and in fact, statements about the media become, all of them are true because all of them describe somebody. And so the challenge for all of us is we are inevitably both consumers, and every time we retweet distributors, and every time we compose producers of media content. And so we're all going to have to learn to adjust to this new world. And it's not. I don't think obviously it's not been an easy transition, and not everyone is responsible about it. But we're going to. I have to believe we're going to learn how to cope with this, because I'm a big. The first and original conservative Edmund Burke said, "The individual is foolish, the species is wise," and I hope that's true. I have to believe that's true. I'm going to believe it's true.
I believe in instinct, and I do think that people are born good, and we have a kind of natural instinct. And that's why when I look at characters like Carrie Lake, I kind of know that it's all showmanship. And I know that deep down she knows that she's playing, this is, unless she's completely insane, that actually she spotted an opportunity, as Trump spotted an opportunity to make a lot of money, to put the Trump name out there, and he didn't even want to be the president, right?
There are bad people, too.
Yeah, there are bad people. Are they born bad? We don't have time for the nature and nurture conversation, but, it's just very interesting how this landscape of, who wants to be a politician in the first place, the kind of person that is drawn to that job. And there has to be a certain ego and level of confidence, and some people are wholly unsuitable for it.
Yeah, but some people who do that work, they just admit it's so hard. And they're so important. And maybe if we respected them more, we would attract, partly on them, maybe if they behave better, we'd respect them more. But maybe if we respected the job more, we might attract the kind of people we say we want.
Okay. David Frum, thank you very much for joining the Weekend Show. An absolute pleasure. I'm Anthony Davis. Please subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5-Minute News Daily podcast, which drops every morning so you can hear me tell you what's happening around the world while you make your coffee. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5-Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.